At 7:58 local time, 26 minutes before the first wave would touch shore, a seismograph 900 miles away was already screaming. And not one person on Patong Beach heard it. The ocean has a cruel way of keeping secrets, but on the morning of December 26, 2004, it felt like it was whispering a warning that nobody was wired to understand. Phuket's Patong Beach was waking up to a postcard-perfect post-Christmas morning. The sun was a warm, golden coin hanging low in the sky, spilling amber light across the soft, white sand. For Julian, a 24-year-old traveler from London, this morning was supposed to be the ultimate antidote to a chaotic year. Sitting on the wooden deck of a beachfront cafe, the condensation from his iced coffee dripping onto his knuckles, he watched the world slowly stretch and wake up. A few tables over, a young family was laughing, a father trying to apply sunscreen to a squirming toddler whose only goal was to chase the local beach dogs. The air smelled of salt, frying banana pancakes, and the faint, sweet scent of frangipani flowers. Everything felt heavy with peace. It was that rare, fragile kind of morning where you feel completely aligned with the universe, utterly unaware that the ground beneath your feet has already cracked open 1,000 miles away. Julian took a deep breath, looking out at the horizon, completely mesmerized by how still the water was. It looked like glass. Beautiful, flat, motionless glass. But that stillness wasn't peace. It was a breath being held. As Julian watched the horizon, a strange sensation crept up his spine. Not a sound, but a sudden, heavy absence of one. The background hum of the beach seemed to abruptly drop in volume. He lowered his coffee cup, his eyes scanning the shoreline. The local Thai boatmen, men who had spent their entire lives reading the volatile moods of the Andaman Sea, had stopped working. They weren't loading supplies or calling out to tourists anymore. Instead, they were standing rigid on the wooden piers, their faces turned toward the open water like compass needles pointing north. Anan, an elderly fisherman whose face was a map of deep wrinkles, carved by decades of sea salt and sun, stepped out of his long-tail boat. He dropped his ropes. He didn't look angry or panicked. He looked deeply, profoundly confused. The water around his boots wasn't lapping against the wood like it usually did. It was behaving weirdly. Julian noticed it too now. The small, gentle waves that had been kissing the shore just 5 minutes ago had completely vanished. The sea wasn't crashing anymore, it was just sliding backward, vanishing into the horizon. Julian frowned, standing up from his chair. A strange magnetic curiosity pulled him closer to the steps of the cafe, his eyes locked on the receding tide. The retreat of the water wasn't slow, it was a sudden, massive exhalation. Within minutes, the ocean bed lay completely bare, stripped of its cover like a blanket pulled off a sleeping giant. Where there had been deep blue water just moments before, there was now a vast, muddy desert stretching out for hundreds of meters. Coral reefs that had lived under dark depth for centuries were suddenly blinking in the harsh morning sunlight. Flopping fish, bright and colorful, were trapped in tiny pools of muddy water, gasping for air in the newly exposed seafloor. To the tourists, this wasn't a warning, it was a miracle. A spectacular, unexpected gift from nature. "Look at that!" a man shouted from the beach, pointing out toward the exposed reef. Julian watched as people began running toward the empty seabed instead of away from it. Tourists left their beach towels behind, laughing as they walked out onto the wet mud to pick up beautiful, exotic seashells that had never seen the light of day. Children squealed with delight, pointing at the stranded marine life. The young father Julian had noticed earlier was now carrying his toddler on his shoulders, walking out into the newly formed desert to get a closer look. Julian took a step forward, intending to follow them, but his boots caught on the sand. Something deep inside his chest felt incredibly tight, a cold knot of dread tying itself around his stomach. It was the birds that first screamed the truth, even if the humans weren't listening. Suddenly, a massive flock of seagulls exploded from the nearby palm trees, their cries sharp, frantic, and chaotic. They didn't circle the beach looking for food as they usually did. They flew straight inland, heading toward the high hills behind the town with desperate, uncharacteristic speed. Down on the sand, the stray beach dogs that usually begged for scraps suddenly tucked their tails between their legs. They began to howl, a low, haunting sound that sent chills down Julian's arms. Then they bolted, running up the concrete roads, ignoring the calls of the people who tried to pet them. Julian turned his head back to Anan, the old fisherman. Anan wasn't looking at the seashells or the stranded fish. He was looking at the very edge of the horizon, where the sky met the sea. His dark eyes were wide, reflecting a sudden, terrible understanding. "Me na me," Anan whispered to himself, his voice trembling so hard the words almost broke. Then, using the full force of his aging lungs, he screamed at the crowd out on the muddy sand. "Run! Go to the hills! Run!" Anna's voice cut through the morning air, but to most people he just sounded like an old man losing his mind. Why run from a beautiful, empty beach? Julian, however, didn't hesitate. The raw panic in the old man's eyes was contagious. He looked back out toward the open sea, forcing his eyes to focus past the tourists, past the exposed coral, right to the edge of the world. At first, it looked like a thick white line drawn with chalk across the blue horizon. But it was moving, and it was growing taller by the second. It wasn't a wave, not the kind surfers wait for with a beautiful curling crest. It was a massive, solid wall of dark, churning water, capped with a violent froth of white foam. It looked like an entire mountain range had detached itself from the earth and was now sprinting toward the coast at the speed of a jet airliner. The sheer scale of it didn't make sense to Julian's brain. It was too big, too fast, too unnatural. The joyful murmurs on the beach began to die down, replaced by a heavy, suffocating confusion. The tourists picking up shells finally looked up. The laughter stopped. In that single frozen second, the collective realization hit the crowd like a physical blow. The ocean was coming back, and it was angry. Then came the sound. It didn't travel through the air, it traveled through the ground, vibrating right up through the soles of Julian's feet. It was a deep, guttural roar, like 100 freight trains screaming through a narrow tunnel at the same time. It was the sound of millions of tons of water obliterating everything in its path, a deafening noise that drowned out the wind, the birds, and the first scattered screams of human terror. "Run!" Julian found his voice, screaming at the top of his lungs, his throat burning. He turned his back on the ocean and began to sprint toward the main road. Behind him, the paradise vanished. The wall of water had reached the shallow bay, and instead of slowing down, it seemed to gather a furious, monstrous energy. The young father who had been carrying his toddler turned around to run, his face pale with horror, but the wet sand beneath his feet was slippery. He stumbled, his eyes locking onto Julian's for a fraction of a second, a desperate, silent plea for help. Julian wanted to stop, his instincts screaming at him to reach out, but the roar behind him was now so loud it felt like it was inside his own skull. He had to keep running. The human brain is a strange thing under pressure. It reduces life to a single repetitive command. Move. 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 Julian's legs pumped furiously, his feet sinking into the dry sand as he scrambled up the beach embankment toward the coastal road. Behind him, the ocean had caught up to the shoreline. The long-tail boats were lifted like toothpicks, snapped in half, and tossed into the air. The beautiful beachfront bungalows, the wooden cafe where he had just been drinking his coffee, the palm trees, they were all erased in an instant, swallowed whole by a churning vortex of black water, mud, and debris. The road was a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos. People were running in every direction, screaming names of loved ones they couldn't see. Cars were trying to reverse, their tires screeching, colliding with one another and trapping passengers inside. Julian didn't look back anymore. He knew that looking back would cost him the precious seconds he didn't have. He saw a concrete hotel structure about 50 meters ahead, its staircases winding up toward the roof. It was his only chance. Gravity was his only savior. He had to get higher than the water or the water would claim him. As Julian reached the base of the hotel stairs, the first tongue of the wave hit the road behind him. It wasn't a clean rush of water, it was a violent, black soup of concrete blocks, broken glass cars, and uprooted trees. The sheer force of the impact shattered the glass windows of the ground floor shops with a sound like gunfire. The water surged around Julian's ankles, cold and incredibly heavy, pulling at him with a terrifying magnetic force. It felt like a physical hand wrapping around his legs, trying to drag him backward into the dark void. He screamed, throwing his weight forward, his fingers clawing at the concrete step of the staircase. He lost his left shoe to the current, the water tearing it right off his foot with effortless power. With a surge of adrenaline he didn't know he possessed, he hauled his body up onto the first landing, scrambling on his hands and knees as the water surged directly underneath him. The ground floor of the hotel was completely obliterated in a heartbeat, swallowed by a roaring torrent that filled the air with the smell of ruptured fuel tanks, crushed earth, and old mud. Julian dragged himself up the stairs higher and higher until he reached the third-floor open balcony. He collapsed against the concrete railing, gasping for air, his chest heaving violently as he looked down at the world he had just been standing in. The paradise was gone. In its place was an unstoppable, violent river that had turned the entire town of Patong into an extension of the ocean. From his vantage point, the scale of the devastation was incomprehensible. Multi-story buildings were shaking under the pressure of the current. Cars, delivery trucks, and entire roofs of houses were floating past like toy boats in a gutter. And then there were the people. Julian watched, helpless, as individuals clung desperately to the tops of palm trees, to lampposts, to anything that was still anchored to the earth. Some were swept away in a flash, disappearing into the dark, churning soup before they could even cry out. The beautiful morning sun was still shining brightly in the blue sky, casting a frustratingly peaceful light over a landscape of absolute ruin. The contrast was horrifying. The sky was perfect, while the earth below was being torn to pieces by the ocean's wrath. The roar of the first wave eventually began to subside, settling into a heavy, rushing sound like a massive, endless waterfall. But the nightmare wasn't over. Julian stood on the balcony, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he gripped the concrete. He looked out toward the horizon again. The water was starting to pull back a second time, dragging the shattered debris of the town out into the deep sea, preparing itself for the next surge. The silence that followed the first wave was the heaviest thing Julian had ever experienced. It was filled only with the distant, heartbreaking echoes of people crying out names into the warm morning air. Parents looking for children. Friends looking for friends. Julian looked down at his bare, bleeding foot, then back out at the ruined coastline. Just 30 minutes ago, he had been a carefree tourist, worrying about nothing more than his travel itinerary. Now he was a survivor standing on the edge of a new, broken world. The Andaman Sea had rewritten history in a matter of minutes, leaving behind a scar that would last for generations. As the second wave began to form in the distance, Julian closed his eyes. The memory of the silent, receding tide forever burned into his soul. Thank you for exploring this emotionally powerful and historic narrative with me.